Joining me here, I'm Ashley Murphy, the founder and principal of Arete Wealth Strategists Australia, a boutique registered investment advisor, a fee-only registered investment advisor working with Australians in America and Americans in Australia. Thank you for joining me here for tonight's presentation on key financial planning steps for those planning to retire to Australia. So a few disclosures before we get into the content here. Of course, all the material that has been sourced here comes from reliable sources. But tonight's presentation, unless you are my client and I'm your advisor, this does not constitute personal financial tax or investment advice. In fact, let me rephrase that. Even if I am your financial advisor, what I'm presenting here tonight does not constitute personal financial tax or investment advice. That is what we do in our private engagements. Let me see here. A little bit about me. So I'm not sure why that keeps skipping through. Sorry. Actually, sorry, my mistake. So our YouTube channel is available. Please feel free to subscribe. That really helps us out in terms of growing awareness and support. You'll see that October's presentation, investment taxes and real estate for high net worth individuals and families seeking global mobility, is up. Our November presentation is going up. Sadly, my assistant's father passed away, and so she had to miss last month. But the November webinar will be up by the end of the week, as will tonight's presentation. I always get asked, "Hey, are you recording tonight's presentation?" And we always record because we always put it on the YouTube channel. So if you happen to miss the presentation, be sure to register because you'll be notified when we do put that presentation up. A little bit about me. How did I come to be an advisor working in this cross-border capacity? Well, that's because I was kind of born into it. I'm a tri-citizen of the US and Australia, moved to the US in 2005. And at that time, I figured there had to be some sort of book or a group or some sort of advisory organization that assisted folks in the transition of moving between countries. It turned out there wasn't. And so for the next 10 years, I looked feverishly to try and find if such a thing existed. I determined after all that time that it didn't. And so I got Arete Wealth Strategists Australia started to help folks in my kind of situation. I took it further, actually, in that I discovered that cross-border folks from all over the world living in the US are entirely underserved. And so I founded the Global Financial Planning Institute, where I train other financial planners in the sorts of issues that we're going to be looking at here tonight. So we work with private clients, as you might have gathered. Here's an example of the sorts of goals that different types of clients are seeking and the results that we've been able to obtain for them, such as an Australian business owner living between Australia and the US. Just heard from that client. He's back in Australia at the moment. He's going to miss our year-end private client event. We're having a virtual happy hour for clients on Thursday night, courtesy of Equal Parts Cocktail Company. Another example would be a high net worth Australian family currently living in the US, but looking to move coincidentally to New Zealand, funnily enough. And the last example was an Australian executive and his family who had permanently relocated to the US, and what we were able to accomplish for him and his family. So enough with that. Let's get into tonight's presentation. So you can see here the major topics we're going to be covering would include your US immigration status and why that is so important in determining the pathway of advice that you would then follow. We'll then, as a consequence of that, we'll talk about the hard exit tax. Did a deeper dive on that last month, so we're still waiting for that video to go up. Healthcare and aged care, we'll talk about options there. Transitioning or distributing your retirement accounts tax efficiently back to Australia. An asset transition plan, so this is other assets outside of your retirement accounts. Minimizing foreign exchange fees and volatility, and updating estate plan. But I wanted to share something very exciting with you all. It was in preparing for tonight's presentation that I actually went and did something that I'm just thrilled with. I want to show that to you. So I'm swapping screens right now. What I'm going to show you is actually a project plan that I built in a program called Notion. Notion is a tool that we use with our clients for the client portal, but it also acts as a project planner as well. So you can see here, what I've done is create a comprehensive project plan for clients who are thinking of moving to Australia. And you can see we have the major subjects sorted by time away from their travel. So you can see here, things to do immediately, things to do 3 years or about 3 years prior. The sooner the better. I'm a big believer that there is a compound return to planning. 6 to 12 months prior to departure, 3 months prior to departure, shortly upon arrival back in Australia, within 6 months of arrival back in Australia, and then those things that really aren't so pressing, important but not urgent, those things to do within 12 to 18 months upon arrival back in Australia. So very excited to start going through that with my clients. So back here, looking at tonight's outline, let's get straight into it as that loads. Okay, so the first thing we need to be mindful of is someone's current and planned US legal status, their immigration status. And what you need to ask yourself is, what is your US legal status? What's your spouse's US legal status? Because there's a host of complications and issues that will go with that. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. We just need to know what your plan is to do about your ongoing US legal status. Why? The US is one of the only countries in the world that practices what's called citizenship-based taxation. So whether you go to Antarctica or to Zimbabwe or join Elon Musk on Mars, it doesn't matter. You're still a US tax resident. And that's going to mean a few things. It's going to mean that you're assessable for US taxes, even when you're in Australia. And if you're married and your spouse is not a US person, then you're going to be filing separate, which could really hit you where it hurts when it comes to tax time, with big capital gains events in particular, I'm thinking of. The other situation is informational filing. So there's FBARs and FATCA filings that need to be made. Not such a big deal. They're actually really simple. That it shouldn't be overstated how complicated they are, because it's really very simple. The penalties is what hurts. The FBAR penalties are always in the news. You're talking about a minimum of $10,000 for a failure a willful failure to follow that, up to 50% of the account value. Shocking penalty for that, and so simple to comply with. But why would you leave that noose hanging around if you could get rid of it? The third thing is to do with the restrictions facing managed investments. And that is that the US person really can't invest in Australian managed investments or any foreign investments of any kind without being subject to this punitive tax regime known as the passive foreign investment company regime. So we want to steer clear of that. So the first thing we need to make up our minds about is, what is the planned ongoing US legal status? Because if there is a plan to give it up, we need to be aware of the HART Act. The HART Act is an act that came into effect in 2008, and it applies essentially an exit tax for two types of individuals that you can see described on your screen. And this is something we went through last month for those that joined me for that presentation. So it affects US citizens or long-term green card holders who meet, and a long-term green card holder is someone who has been on that green card, not necessarily in the US, you could be anywhere, as I said a minute ago, who has been on that green card for 8 of the past 15 years. So if that is you, then there's going to be 3 tests that are going to be applied to determine whether this 877A, Internal Revenue Code Section 877A, which deals with the HART Act, applies to you. And bad news if it does. Why? Because there's 2 major problems. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But the 3 tests are what you see on my screen. Now, I'm guessing this couple on the right-hand side, they just found out that they did not become covered expatriates subject to this, so they're happy. There's the income test. That is, did you have a federal net income tax liability averaging $178,000 as of 2022? Now, Please note that word, income tax, not income. Your adjusted gross income, 178, that would capture a lot of people. We're talking the income tax. So you got to be making a good amount of money, the north of about $600,000, depending on your filing status, to have a federal tax liability of that amount, and do that over a couple of years. Another way that folks can get caught by that income test is if there was, say, a massive deferred compensation payment that was made, that could, that could skew that 5-year average, because that's what we're doing, is we're averaging your federal tax liability over that period. The second test that they have, which I think is very sly, the second test they have is the net worth test. Do you have a global net worth in excess of $2 million US, wherever it may be, in the couch cushions, your Australian superannuation account, that investment property that you still have somewhere? Everything gets counted. Oh, and worse, assets that are held in joint title count 100% for both parties, assuming you're dealing with a spousal situation who are both looking to exit. In either case, or it doesn't matter, assets held in joint title count 100% for that individual. The third thing is one that we don't see often, because we don't work with people that aren't compliant with their taxes, but you need to be certify on that form 8854. That's the form that you submit to expatriate, to actually formally do that, that you've complied with all state and federal tax obligations for the past 5 years. So that's the exit tax. There's plenty of planning that can be done to minimize or avoid that altogether. And maybe one of these days I'll do a deep dive on the exit tax, how that's calculated. It's not a straightforward thing at all. They divvy up your estate into 5 different buckets, and they're all taxed kind of differently. But there are ways, there are proactive ways that you can simply retitle or gift or perform other transactions so as to get under that limit, or there are other things that can be done to manage that particular tax liability. So the next decision we need to be mindful of are real estate decisions. Excuse me. Sorry. Real estate decisions. So I think no one's going to forget to think about this, of course, but moving from the US back to Australia, we need to take stock of real estate values. I was speaking to a lovely client of mine last week who happens to live in Texas, and their plan, like me, is to ultimately move back to Australia in retirement. The trouble that they're going to have, though, and as we spoke about in some detail in our meeting, was there's a big difference between the price of a home in the suburbs of Houston versus a price in the home, the price of a home in the suburbs of Brisbane. And you're looking at about twice as much, even with the currency advantage that you currently enjoy coming from US dollars to Australian dollars. It's still about twice as much. So the question then becomes, can we save that difference in the time that we have to plan? Can we possibly take a mortgage? Is it feasible with your cash flows and your financial situation to take a mortgage? Or what's this 5-letter acronym that we see at the bottom there, SBLOC? S-block is how I'd pronounce it. And that's a securities-backed line of credit. What that is essentially a type of margin loan where you use your portfolio as security, and then you borrow that amount, and you would buy a house that way. So those are some ways that you might deal with that real estate decision. But I'm probably planting that seed in your head that this is a big deal. This is something you need to think about. There could be a disparity between your US property and your Australian property. Less so if you're in, say, the Bay Area, New York, major metropolitan areas. But for many Americans might be surprised to hear that in terms of affordability, Australian real estate in the major capital cities, especially Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, is shocking, is far worse than it is in the US. So let's move on to talk about healthcare. Now, coming back to Australia, one of the first things you're going to want to do is re-enroll in Medicare. Medicare is a wonderful program to have in Australia. It, of course, it shares the same name in the US. Medicare in the US is a different thing. It's essentially the socialized or public option of healthcare for those over the age of 65. In Australia, it's like, it's kind of like that, but for everyone. So that's what Medicare is, as many of us on today's call know about. Problem you might find if you've been away for a good number of years is you could be subject to this lifetime health cover loading. And the best article I found on this comes from Medibank Private, as you can see here on the next page, and they talk about what it is. So essentially, you'll get hit with the 2% loading added to your premium for every year you're without hospital coverage. Now, you'd say, I wasn't living in Australia. Why would I have had private Australian health insurance coverage? Turns out that is a legitimate excuse, or reason, I should say, not excuse, and you can actually get rid of that, as I did when I moved back to Australia with my family in 2021. I had to get a statement from the immigration department, and they said, yep, this guy actually wasn't here over the age of 30, so we're not going to hit him with this, because I went and got private health insurance after that. So anyway, something to be aware of. Of course, making that decision, are you going to take private or just use public healthcare? That's another decision to be made. Now, what about aged care? I think this is a conversation far more common in the US than it is in Australia, in large part because of this staggering cost of healthcare, and needless to say, what's called long-term care, aged care, same thing, they're used interchangeably, long-term care in the US. So it is an absolutely bankrupting event in the US. Or there is Medicaid that steps in and provides cover for folks that are indigent or can't afford it. Typically, people would buy long-term care insurance in the US, but even then, the long-term care market, insurance market has been a little volatile in the past decade or so, with premiums increasing and coverage decreasing because of that staggering cost. It's not that the insurance companies are merely just greedy and charge whatever they can. It's that the cost of what they're paying is staggering as well. So there's a tool available here from myagedcare.gov.au, where they'll actually quote you what you'll pay. And the amounts that you'll pay, let's swap back to the home care package. Do you have a partner? Do you live with your partner? Let's say yes. Your finances, combined income's 50,000 and total financial assets are 2.5 million. Let's run that. So you're looking at a daily amount. I mean, you're going to probably think you rub your eyeballs and think you're in a dream. $35 Australian dollars a day. In the US, that would be 10 times that number, or I would say up to 10 times that number in US dollars. So a staggering difference, but nevertheless, something that you can't forget about. Another point I'd like to make, which is not so much specific about moving from the US to Australia, but an article that I like to bring to clients' attention from the Wall Street Journal. I'm just going to bring this up very quickly. The expenses people often forget about in retirement. This is just something that was on my mind because we're talking about it right now. So someone wrote to the columnist and said, hey, what are the expenses that people tend to forget about in retirement? Well, it so happens in 2017, the Society of Actuaries put together an analysis on exactly that. Turns out the number one thing people forget about that really can throw their budgets off is home maintenance. Home maintenance. So that's particularly a factor where I now live, back in the Midwest in the US, where you've got this freeze-thaw cycle, which really plays hell on the concrete and the roads and so forth. But the point remains the same, and that is, if you need a new air conditioner, a new roof, and you're told that that's going to be thousands and thousands of dollars, if you haven't been accruing for that, that's going to be a shocker. But I digress. So let's get back here. We're talking about healthcare. What are you going to do for healthcare back in Australia? This is where you may see a little bit of an integration with the immigration side. So coming to the US in those instances where I have clients that find love later in life and actually want to move from Australia to the US, I'd say this could be a real problem. If you don't spend 5 years in the US paying Social Security taxes, you're not insured for Medicare. And when you get to age 65, if you have to pay private health insurance coverage in the US, you're going to find that that is a significant line item. So just watch out for that. Foreign exchange plan. This is a funny topic. I'm actually very passionate about it because I'm all about saving my clients money wherever I can or bringing value wherever I can. And this is one of these boring topics people pay no attention to, but I hope to convince you that it's worthy of your attention just here. So this is a spreadsheet that I use. We've got this Google Finance formula in here that brings in the live exchange rate, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But if you were converting $1 million US to Australian dollars at the live exchange rate right now, it would be worth 1.479 million Australian dollars if you owned a bank. I don't own a bank, you don't own a bank. We have to pay fees. The best rate you're going to get is with Interactive Brokers, where your total fee is little less than $30 on that conversion. The typical thing that I'll find that most people are doing is working with a bank. So the typical spread that they would charge, assuming you don't have any status with your bank, like you're not part of the premier side of the bank or the private side of the bank, you're going to be charged about 2%, 1 to 2%. So on $1 million, how much is that? That's about $30,000 for the privilege of converting your money. And this is why it's so important to me that people don't get ripped off. I've got a comparison of different providers here. For our clients, we've negotiated a special rate with OFX. That's 30 basis points. So you're still paying about $4,400. So to me, it's still significant, but it's nothing like Interactive Brokers, of course. Schwab will do the conversion, depends on the amount. They can be negotiated with a little bit more leverage on our side coming from the institutional world. Wise or the retail OFX rate, you're looking at about 60 basis points. They have recently introduced algorithmic pricing, so it does vary a little bit, depends on the time of day, depends on the amount, volatility in exchange rates. So that will vary a little bit, but historically, that's the spread that they used to charge was 60 basis points. One thing I'm often saying to clients, thankfully hasn't come up lately because the savings rates between Australia and the US are so small, people never bring it up. But in the old days, people used to say, well, gosh, I'm going to move my money to Australia because I can get a higher interest rate on my savings. And I'd say, don't do it so fast. You want to be careful and considered about this because exchange rate volatility is massive. This is one of my favorite websites to go to, Daily FX. And let's just have a look at the Aussie rate. I'd like to focus in particularly on the last month, let alone if we go back to October. Last 2 months is even more insane. So we would see down in November 10th, as you can see here, we're down around 63.6. In the space of a month, the rate has rocketed up 4 cents to 67.6. Huge, and it really took off a week ago when the Federal Reserve said that they were not going to raise rates. This prompted a euphoric response in stock markets, and you can see that that really boosted the strength of the US dollar at that time. So the point I'm making here is when a client says, oh, no, Ashley, listen, I want to hurry up and get all my money over to this country. It could be under country X or Y, it changes depending on interest rates. I want to hurry up and get all my money there because I can earn 1% more on my savings account. I would say not so fast, because if we don't take a measured approach to your foreign exchange conversion, look at this. Currently, we're at 67.6. If ceteris paribus, as they say in Latin, all things being equal, if that happened if it went up another 2.3 cents or 3.4%, 2.3 cents or 3.4%, that would cost you $50,000. $50,000 for that 2.3 cent move. You can just imagine how much it's cost in the move from 63 cents or 62.5 where it hit earlier this year. So big differences in exchange rates. That's why you want to put together a really solid plan for converting your funds. Now, the other point I wanted to make here, which we're going to get onto shortly, is to do with the longer term foreign exchange rate risk. So I'm trying to zoom this out to show you a 10-year period. This is the Aussie US dollar exchange rate over the past decade. And you can see it's certainly fluctuated quite a bit. For a flash of a minute there, it was below 57 cents, right as that COVID pandemic hit. And back at the end of the GFC, the sort of the aftermath, if you will, of that, the Australian dollar was above parity with the US dollar. So we've seen huge swings over that period of time. Why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because we're talking about a 30 or 40-year event where you're moving back to Australia. If you still have assets in the US, and I recommend that clients do keep some proportion, not the majority, probably not the majority, but some proportion in US dollars for reasons I'll get into in a moment. But if you've still got some proportion of your assets in US dollars, and you begin to see the Aussie dollar really creep up in value and get back, say, into the 80 cents or 90 cents, that is having a staggering effect on your purchasing power. And so we need to be mindful of that. And can it do that? Could it possibly go to $1, a parity or above? Absolutely. The future is unknown. And foreign exchange rates, it's not like looking at the long-term performance of the S&P 500 where the trend line is very clear. It's been going up and up and up for 100 years or longer. With foreign exchange, it can go up, it can go flat, it can go down for extended periods of time, but then revert. So you're dealing with something that's volatile. And for that reason, I counsel that clients put together a foreign exchange plan to convert that. Typically, I would say over a 2 or 3 year period, every quarter, we want to be converting a tranche of that money. If it looks like it's particularly undervalued, hey, we'll do a little bit more. And if it looks like it's maybe a temporary spike or it's going against you, we might do a little bit less. But what we're trying to do is get that average rate over that period of time to de-risk that undertaking. I noticed that questions come up, so I will jump in there. Ashley, will you make the Wall Street Journal article available? I can't know because it is not mine. It is the Wall Street Journal's article. But what I can tell you, Nancy, because I like you so much, is that it's called, you can type that into Google and that will come up for you. All right, so let's move on, shall we? So the next thing we do is an asset transition plan. Now, this might seem very dull, and to some, not me, but to some, maybe it is. What we do is a before and after balance sheet of a client's investable assets. So we'll go through and we'll say, here's your cash, here's your after-tax investments, retirement accounts before, in this person's name and client one's name, client two's name, and the joint account total in US dollars and Australian dollars, and then what it looks like after. Why do we do that? Because we're trying to convey this is what we expect will remain in US dollars. This is what we expect will move to Australian dollars. This is how we're going to transition this retirement account depending on your US status. That may be possible. We'll talk about that. Actually, that's on the next slide. So we want to say this is where you are now and this is where you'll end up. And maybe there's some taxes involved in moving from the before to the after. But I mentioned earlier that I'll talk about some of the advantages that the US has in the investment domain and why I recommend keeping some portion back in US dollars. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. It may be slowly, by degrees, losing that status, but it still is the world's reserve currency. The second reason, as shown by the biennial study that Morningstar put out, called the Global Fund Investor Experience Study, you can take a look at that, and you'll see that the US comes out #1 in that study. It is, if you could invest your money anywhere in the world to get the best overall experience, it would be the US. It would be the US based on costs. It would be the US based on the availability of funds, the diversity and number of funds, and it would be the US based on disclosure. You wouldn't believe the amount of detail that is provided about these different funds in the US. Now, there may be one or two folks out there that would say, well, actually, I looked at that report too, and Australia and the Netherlands, funnily enough, come out as tied for a gold medal place. True, but the devil is in the detail. Actually, Australia comes out the worst of anyone when it comes to disclosures that funds are required to make. Many make more than the minimum, but it's still, they don't need to tell you anything. The amount of detail in a superannuation statement blows my mind. I mean, they would barely even tell you anything about their portfolio and what they're actually invested in, because it causes problems. People ask questions and it's a hassle. So Australia scores poorly on that regards, but the devil is in the detail with costs. In this study that Morningstar do, the Global Fund Investor Experience Study, they do not consider trading costs, and they do not consider platform or custodial fees. So for US clients, you may be familiar, since October of 2019, when Charles Schwab kicked off a price war, which saw them acquire TD Ameritrade, they brought the price of stocks and ETF trading down to exactly that, nothing. It doesn't cost a penny to trade a stock or an ETF in the US. Mutual funds, it still does, about $24 at Schwab, but still and there's no custodial fee. In Australia, you're looking at a discount operation would charge you $30 per trade. And for many of the platforms that are out there, you're looking at 10, 20, or 30 basis points. That's up to 0.3% for the privilege of doing business with these firms and them having your money. So it is a significantly higher investment cost environment. And so it's for those reasons that I counsel keeping some portion of your assets back in the US. Let's move on. But before I do, I saw a second question popped up. As an answer to that. Yes, you're welcome, Nancy. Okay, next, let's talk about retirement account distributions or transfers. It's really going to depend on your US status. Yet again, that's why I began with that point about your US status and what the plan is long term, because if you're still a US person, bad news for you in this regard, at least. And that is that if you're a US person, then the savings clause that exists in the tax treaty is going to mean that you're always a US tax resident. And so if you have a 401k, an IRA, or whatever you have, it's still going to be taxed by the US. There's no getting out of it. But if you gave up that citizenship and you are now, or that green card, and you are now purely just an Australian resident, then you can revert to treatment as described in the tax treaty, which thankfully is a lot better than what Americans must face. Now, what does that look like? That looks like the Australian treatment is that essentially, excuse me, let me back up. Sorry, the tax treaty says in Article 18.1, it says that you're going to be taxed in the country where you're presently resident. So if you are in Australia, you have a US retirement account, it says only Australia can tax you on that account. Great. So what's the next thing we need to know? Well, how does Australia tax foreign retirement accounts like a 401k or an IRA? Simple. The way they do it is they treat it as though they're foreign trusts. How's a foreign trust taxed, you ask? The way they're taxed is the Australians say, well, we're going to consider the taxable basis of this account to be your contributions and your employer's contributions. So any growth that you've had in that account is going to be ordinary income taxable, not capital gains taxable, ordinary income taxable in Australia. There are some advanced techniques to enhance that outcome, however, so that you can effectively get a complete step up or very near total step up in basis on that account when moving to Australia. For higher net worth folks that have saved a couple $1 million into that account, that has real financial impact, because if you're talking about distributing a $2 million IRA over the remainder of your days, you're probably going to be paying, let's just take an estimate. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is expiring in 2025, so we're going to see the 22% tax rate revert to 25% in the US. Let's take an average of a 25% tax rate on those distributions, and your $2 million has an embedded $500,000 tax contingent tax liability sitting right in it. So you might look at your balance, you log into Schwab, or you log into Advizon, and you see that actually my account says it's 2 million. Wrong. It's 2 million minus that contingent tax liability that the US citizen or green card holder would still have to pay. The other thing you want to do is to update your estate plan. So in moving back to Australia, I've spoken to enough international estate planners now that the advice is pretty consistent. And they say you want a will that really deals with the assets in that country. So if you're moving back to Australia, you're going to want to have an Australian will that deals with Australian assets and US wills, or there's other ways around it too, by the way, but US wills and trusts that deal with US property. Now, I just mentioned trusts, but trusts they're a known unknown to me. There's an awful lot that I know about this area, but what I do know is that a US trust may not receive favorable taxation treatment in Australia, and an Australian trust definitely doesn't get favorable tax treatment in the US. They don't recognize each other's tax laws. So trusts can be tricky. Work with appropriate counsel on those particular matters. Also, be sure to update your powers of attorney to make sure you've got a competent adult around who's actually around, who hasn't passed on or isn't still back in the US, who is able to act on your behalf if you're unable to. So that's what I had to say there. The other one, this doesn't come up too often, and not so much for retirees, but for folks younger moving back with children, you want to make sure, or who are spending significant time in Australia, you want to make sure that you get guardianship provisions that apply in Australia. Otherwise, all hell could break loose, because if your US guardians come over, they fly over in a plane. I can tell you, in this day and age with people trafficking as it is, it's very difficult, if not impossible, without the documents being there to say that this American that's just showed up, in fact, has jurisdiction and is the appropriate adult custodian for that particular child. So that's another thing worth mentioning. All right, so that really wraps up the key elements that we want to look at today. Next month, I'm going to do a special. Some of my long-term watchers might remember this, but I last did this in 2001 after the terrible results that we saw with the American withdrawal out of Afghanistan. I ran a fundraiser where I did a premium webinar, went into a lot more detail than what I normally do, and I'm going to do the same thing as a fundraiser to help out women and children in Afghanistan. That's what I did back in 2021. I'm going to do that again in January, a fundraiser. I haven't decided on the charity just yet, but I'll let you know what it is at the time of the webinar. We're going to go into a lot of detail here, but there will be a fee for this webinar. You'll get value for money. There'll even be a handout, so the slides will be made available. It will really be a reference tool of value to you. And Social Security is always a crowd pleaser. Everyone loves the idea of getting free money, and there really are some things to know about in working with Social Security. If anything I've said here tonight piques your interest, you feel like we might be an appropriate firm, a boutique specialized firm for you, then feel free to reach out. Click on that Get Started link at the top of our page, and you can schedule an appointment there. And if you're interested in downloading our key financial data sheet, you can get that here as a PDF. It's got Australian and US tax rates on it. Flip it the other side and it shows you the Australian rates. And that really wraps things up for tonight. I see, Steve, you're welcome. Thank you. Just want to see if there are any other questions. Anonymous has written in, how is divorce of Australians living in the US treated with oh my goodness, what a question. Now, what's funny here, Anonymous, is that I actually ran the only webinar dealing with that topic back in August for the GFP, the Global Financial Planning Institute planners. It wasn't dealing with Australia specifically. This was an attorney based out of Kentucky who, this is his specialty. So if you're in Kentucky, I can make a referral. And if you're not, I'm afraid maybe he can make a referral, but I can't. It boils down to where jurisdiction of the divorce, okay, yeah, in California, jurisdiction of the divorce is handled. And in the case study that he gave, it was a client from Italy who did very well, was very wealthy, was getting divorced from his wife. He chose Italian laws as the jurisdiction to try and go through the divorce because it would have completely left his wife with nothing at all. However, while there is some discretion in this is what I gathered, and I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to be seen to be practicing law, but my takeaway was that there was some discretion over the choice of jurisdiction, not much, but a little bit, and the US provided a much more favorable outcome. So that's all I can really say in trying to answer that question there. Loretta, good to see you. Glad you could make it here tonight. Any other questions? I'll give folks another moment here, but otherwise, I'm going to look forward to getting back to my evening. Do you do financial planning for divorcing couples? No, I don't. I am a fiduciary and I believe passionately in advisors sticking to their area of core competence. When I have clients getting divorced, turns out there is a subspecialty of financial planning for, would you believe, for divorcing clients. And I would recommend you speak to one of them. The designation of the folk you're looking for is a CDFA. It's a Certified Divorce Financial Analyst. That's who you want to talk to. Really more of a project engagement. They'll get you through that. And then in cross-border, this is another specialized area as well. I'm trying to find one that understands Australian tax treaty. I don't think you're, I wish, I think you're probably going to be paying a lot of money. You'd have to get two folks. You'd have to get someone from Australia who can act as your interpreter for Australian tax laws, I'm afraid, because the specialist you're looking for just might not exist. Try reaching out to a lady, Renuka Summers. Look her up on LinkedIn and see if she will help, but she may not be able to right now as she's going through a bit of a transition. Renuka Summers. So have a look there. Anyway, let me see. The Q&A is blowing up and I haven't had that panel open. So let me go there. Okay, no, sorry, the chat, the opposite one, sorry. Let me see here. So Nancy, great, looking forward to that. Frederick, good to see you, have to go, yep. Selena, you're welcome. Nancy, do you have a comment on how US annuities are treated? I do have a comment. Thanks, Ash. Jeff, you're welcome. Thanks, bro. I meant to call you on the weekend. William Lyons, does your home count? Yes, it certainly does. Yep. Thank you. Great session. So there's your answer. Well, yes, it does. Nancy, the comment on annuities. So annuities, you can apply for, and I have asked this one before of Australian Tax Council, you can apply for a private ruling on your annuity and the Aussies will tell you how much, essentially what in the US is referred to as your exclusion ratio, what percentage of that annuity is subject to taxation. So I would encourage you to talk to a CPA about that. Rosemary asks, how does everything you said apply to Australians returning to Australia? It all applies, Rosemary. This presentation was written from that perspective. It was if, depending on your US immigration status, maybe you were on a temporary visa, a green card holder, or a dual citizen, everything I've said here tonight is applicable to one of those three individuals. So this is entirely relevant. What it's not relevant to is, say, the returning American to the US. That's a totally different kettle of fish, as they say. Andrew Taylor, glad you could make it. I've been meaning to write a reply to you. Ben Yates, as I mentioned already, so I think that's everything, everyone. Oh, does Social Security get taxed in Australia, the US? If we look at the treaty, we'll find the answer to that, and I'll be going through that next month in that premium webinar. Answer is Social Security is in the tax treaty. The US reserves the right to tax it. So whether you file your US tax return or not, I believe it's 25.5% ends up being withheld anyway, given that they're paying it to a foreign individual. More to be said, more to be said. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me here. Have a wonderful Christmas break or holidays, depending on your faith tradition, and we'll see you back in the new year.